Hello, I'm Christian Bellak, one of the authors of Chapter 4, which is entitled The Use of Investment Incentives, the Cases of Research and Development Related Incentives and International Investment Agreements. The chapter was written jointly with my colleague Markus Leibrecht, who now teaches at the University of Reading branch in Malaysia. Just quickly on terminology. From now on, I will use R&D for research and development, and I will use IIA, which stands for International Investment Agreements. I will also use FDI, which stands for Foreign Direct Investment, and I will use BITs, which stands for Bilateral Investment Agreements. We had the pleasure to comment on rationales for granting investment incentives and on the empirical evidence of two particular types of incentives, namely R&D related incentives and IIAs. We focus on R&D related incentives and IIAs, not least because these two types of incentives find substantial interest both in economic policy and academic research alike. There are several clear differences between these two types of investment incentives. R&D related incentives are often targeted at specific activities of companies, domestic and foreign. Comparable incentives would be wage subsidies in order to attract labor-intensive FDI. On the other hand, IIAs can be seen as incentives with the aim to enhance the impact of other location factors on foreign direct investment. Comparable incentives would be the simplification of the regulatory business environment. But why are such incentives granted at all? The first part of the chapter deals with this question. We start off from the normative view. Can investment incentives be justified in a market economy, and discuss the usual factors, allocation, distribution, and macro stabilization as economic justifications for government intervention. But in reality, we may see government intervention also in the absence of market failure. We therefore also discuss reasons for investment incentives from a political economy perspective. And we also consider a more subtle group of incentives, namely those where the normative justification, say a severe case of market failure, is given, but the government does not intervene. The government decides not to implement or effectively enforce government regulation to spur investment. A prime example in this respect is the lax enforcement of environmental regulations in order to attract mining companies. Next, we show descriptively that both types of investment incentives gain importance as a means to spur investment. Direct financial R&D incentives are relatively more important than fiscal tax incentives, and both types of incentives increase somewhat as the percentage of GDP over the time period considered. Likewise, the cumulative number of international investment agreements has substantially increased from around 100 back in the 1980s to more than 3,000 already in 2012, although not all of them are in force. In parallel, according to UNCTAD, the total number of the known treaty-based investor-state arbitrations based on international investment agreements has risen to roughly 740, an all-time high, so investors make increasingly use of IIAs. After sketching the descriptive evidence on the growing importance of investment incentives, we ask whether these incentives are actually effective in attracting foreign direct investment. After conducting a limited literature survey, we conclude that the existing literature points to a minor importance of both financial and fiscal R&D incentives in promoting R&D intensive FDI. Likewise, we find little support for BITs being an important measure to attract FDI in the relevant literature. However, we also stress that BITs may contribute to the sustainability of existing FDI, as one aim of BITs is to allow investors to take legal action against host governments. So, which conclusions do we derive from our analysis? First and foremost, fiscal and financial incentives should be used by governments to attract FDI only to limited scale. These incentives are often second to stable and credible institutional environments in importance for FDI promotion. In countries with large institutional problems, fiscal and financial incentives will not help much to attract FDI. And even in countries with a sound institutional environment, the evidence in favor of investment incentives being effective is limited. As a corollary to conclusion 1, we note that investment incentives must not be used as substitutes for the lack of sound domestic institutions. Secondly, however, investment incentives can be one element of a broader national development strategy once general institutional and economic fundamentals are in place. To give you an example from IIAs, although IIAs may unfold their protection effect best in environments where institutional factors are insufficient, the combination of a non-functioning infrastructure and IIAs cannot result in a successful FDI attraction policy. Third, politicians have to be aware of unintended consequences from granting investment incentives. For example, Hungary just recently announced a cut in its corporate income tax rate to 9%, to the lowest level in the EU. Besides the negative welfare consequences from tax competition, the negative consequences for tax revenues will be felt shortly there. So all in all, our chapter comments on the rationales for granting investment incentives and provides empirical evidence of two particular types of incentives which find substantial interest both in economic policy and academic research alike. Thank you very much.